All right, so the next one we're going to do, we're going to watch Drew Durnil's I'm From This Country, which you got to see the actual video. I did 11,000 views. His reaction, 137. I was like, oh, man. I got so few of his people to come and watch the actual video, but still, that's fine. I got so many views. After he posted his, I got so many views. I actually got a really low amount of views on that one, I felt.
My friends, words will fail to prepare.
But I guess a big part of that was probably I felt that because I put so much work into this one. This one took a long time because for Drew's episode, because for one, I kept running into issues in the research where, you know, I often try to find relatives of the guests, because that's just a technique in genealogy that I've learned is really useful, is connecting with living relatives. And especially with trying to tell the story of more recent family, I found a lot of cousins of his and a lot of people, but I've in all of the guests I've had and a lot of the research I've done, I don't think I've run into as many people putting up a wall with his as I did with his family. Not necessarily in like a way like they were, at least no one said this to me in any sort of way of like, you know, we are not comfortable with you doing this. But basically it was just, you know, we're not comfortable being involved sort of thing. And so it actually made the research really difficult, especially trying to piece together the story. And a big part of the original part of the research was trying to find his grandmother's involvement in World War II, which I'm still working on. But basically, like, he sent me a video, which we'll see in my video, where I asked him, send me a video saying what you know about your ancestry on this line and what you'd like to learn. And a lot of the video he was talking about, well, I really want to learn about my grandmother's involvement in World War II, and I'd heard this and that. And he talks a bit more about it in his reaction. But I spent so much time trying to get that story figured out. And a big part of the roadblock I hit was just because I didn't have enough information from the family, and Drew didn't have enough information himself to be able to really dive into it. So I hit a lot of difficulties with this one, but in the end, with the final story, I mean, I knew from the beginning that I was going to talk about the Westenskau family and the Scandinavian stuff, but it was the in-between part that it was like the hard part. So, all right, let's
Today I'm going to finally learn about my ancestry because I don't really know a whole lot. I know my family can be traced back somewhere to like England, Scotland, Wales, and maybe some Nordic countries. But the problem with this old DNA test that I took is it was more of a range. Like there was a chance that I didn't actually come from Germanic Europe. But this video is called Uncovering Drew Durnil's Danish Immigration Ancestry. I let Jarrett Ross here, a professional genetic genealogist, dive deep into my family's history. I'm a little scared. I don't really know what's going to pop up. I guess I'm Danish though.
1851. Falster Island,
again,
Denmark.
Oh wow.
A 16-year-old
I'm already so shocked about this. I will be honest, I don't remember really hearing much about my family's history. I know my grandma was born in Salt Lake City and was maybe a part of a Mormon family.
A musician named Hans is walking home after being the lone musician to play music at a party in a nearby town.
Nice.
Something he had been doing
Bass.
since the age of 12. As Hans walked down the street, violin in hand, he overheard a conversation about some American priests who'd come to town. These priests were preaching about a new religion.
So I'm guessing that I have some sort of relation to this man, maybe.
Founded in America, for which they had just finished translating their religious texts to Danish.
Really? So this is a Mormon traveling to Denmark.
This new religion was quite intriguing to Hans and would become the catalyst to greatly change his future, leading him and his siblings to travel.
I don't know anything about Mormonism. Like, maybe my grandma does, but I don't.
Travel over 50 to 100 miles to build a new life.
I just know the basic stuff.
Hello, everybody. I am Jarrett Ross, the GeneaVlogger, and on today's video, I will be discussing Drew Durnil. This was, I think, my first major video with the new background after I quit the job. Because beforehand, my background was the big banner with, you know, my logo, the company DNA Labs International, and then the whole opt-in campaign that the company was doing. But then once I quit, it was like, okay, well, I obviously want to redo stuff. And so this was the first video I did with that. But actually, I've changed it around a bit. I actually got for the useful chart posters, I finally got poster frames, so a little bit better. And then I've been working with videographer friend of mine, trying to just, slightly up the quality
Mormon
of things.
Pioneer Ancestry.
This is so crazy. Oh, wow. Yeah, this was like the most awkward photo I've ever taken in my life.
Drew Durnil is a geography, history, and gaming YouTuber who has been making videos for just over 10 years. I first learned about Drew when I did a reaction to his DNA test results in May of 2021, and then we had the chance to meet while at VidCon in 2022.
I was showing.
While at VidCon, I asked Drew what he knew about his family, and while he knew a good bit, it seemed to be somewhat hazy.
Definitely hazy. I mean, I can think back. I was lucky enough to live with my great-grandma for a time. She told me a lot of stories, but I was so young. I really don't remember that much.
I offered to research his tree for the series, and he sent me his DNA results in a basic family tree, and then I was off researching.
Man, this is
so cool. As I was reviewing what he sent me, I quickly noticed something interesting with Drew's tree. When Drew was born, he not only had 5 great-grandparents still alive,
wow,
but he also had
yes. Like I said, I was and I lived with my great-grandma, this lady, Vera Mae Russell.
Second great-grandmothers alive as well.
She lived for a long time, so I've always been super thankful for that.
One of those second great-grandmothers was through Drew's purely...
Yeah, so actually, I was saying before his grandmother's involvement, it's his great-grandmother Vera's involvement in World War II that he was asking a lot about.
Maternal line, so I decided to ask him what he knew about this line of his family.
Oh yeah. So I consider myself to be extremely lucky because I was fortunate at a young age to live with.
I have to say, I was blown away by some of the age gaps in his family tree, because especially in his recent family ancestry, he had some very short DNA gaps, which were really interesting, because at first I was like, I don't even know if this is real, because these seem like they were unrealistically young when they had kids, But then with the DNA, I mean, the DNA proved very conclusively that it was them. It was either them, or it would have been like some older sibling that for some reason they said, no, it's this younger sibling. But usually it's the opposite way, where if someone's really young and they have a kid, they say, oh, well, actually it's the older sibling or the mom or the grandparents that are the parents, but really it was the young. So I thought that was really interesting. But yeah, Drew should do a react to this video. That would be great. Although then I'll see another reaction video get way more views than my own video. Although it probably would get me a ton of stuff. Odd Danish mid-1800s, I think I spend a lot of time on. Yeah. And probably has to do with Mormon rules relationships. Well, that side was actually, I think that one was his dad's side that I was thinking of. Although I think there was some Mormon connection, if I remember correctly, on his dad's side. If they are a lot of Mormons, it makes sense. There's a culture there of young mothers. Yeah.
With both my grandma and her mom, my great-grandma. So I was able to obtain pretty good amount of information. Obviously, a lot more from my grandma, Linda. But the basics to her upbringing was that she was born in Salt Lake City, and she might have been raised Mormon. I'm still not entirely sure about that one. She definitely wasn't Mormon later in life, but maybe as a kid. When it comes to, as far as my great-grandma, her mom, this one's a little bit more difficult. I do remember certain things that she would tell me at a young age.
Yeah, see, this part is where I had to cut a lot out, because he was basically, and she'd tell me about World War II and this and that about World War II and that. And so I really want to learn about World War II. And it's like, I had nothing good to include in the video about that. So I was like, yeah, I'm going to have to cut out this part, because that's just going to leave too much, I don't know how to word it, but, just too much that people wouldn't be resolved in the video. Then people be like, well, what about her involvement in World War II?
I also remember her teaching me a lot about the history of America. Yeah, I do think that I credit her with the reason why I'm such a geography nerd. Hearing about the Mayflower from her, that was probably the first time I'd heard of that ship. She would teach me a little bit. She talked about World War II a lot. About a history. I mean, again, I was like 8 years old, so this was going right over my head. In general, and maybe that's where
that honestly might be what sparked my interest.
Yeah.
Again, I don't know why she was telling like a 6 or 7-year-old this stuff, but I guess I found it fascinating.
I still don't really know. I always ask other family members. Apparently, she did a lot during World War II. Like, she went to Europe multiple times, and I think she was working in, like, it was definitely with planes. It was definitely certain plane manufacturers, Boeing or something like that.
I looked so many places to try to find information, and I just never found it. And there was some stuff that I've been like, there's some stuff that I've been trying to work on more, and like getting like some of the harder to find records. But part of it is that it was just a lot of generalized, like, might have worked with planes, might have been here, traveled abroad, and like I couldn't find any, passenger lists or anything like that. And yeah, I don't know. That was a consideration. It does sound like she might have done classified stuff. It's possible, but I wasn't sure. It was also my thought was maybe she worked with the oh gosh, what the whatever show that they call it, but like they're like the group of people that go abroad to give stuff to soldiers, like hand out drinks and stuff. And like, I think they had a scene of that, if you ever saw the Pacific, where it's like they're getting back from battle to the base and they're like, battle torn and everything. And they're walking up and there are these, hot chicks in nurse outfits handing out, cups of drinks and stuff. And it's like just such a, mind, yeah, mind, whatever, you know what I mean? So, yeah, Michael, my great-grandmother's youngest brother, married in 1960, and his youngest is only 3 years older than me. Interesting. Oh, and thank you, Weaving Scorpion. Yes, smash that like button, everybody. Smash that like button, all. A couple of my cousins met our second great-grandmother when they were little. I met 2 of my great-grandmothers. One lived to be 100, the other lived to be 109.
So I know some pieces of information, but obviously I would definitely like to know a lot more.
Oh yeah, this is
Drew's great-grandmother Vera was born on May 18th, 1927.
I loved finding this picture, and I will say some of the stuff I found that I was like so hoping I'd get a really big reaction from him, I didn't get quite as big of a reaction, but there was some stuff that I was like, I wonder what his parents are going to think, because I found some really good photos and videos of his family that I was like, oh, this is going to surprise them. And I posted this photo of him with his grandmother way back. But one of the things that he didn't make note of, and maybe he didn't see it, was, so I show this photo of him with his great grandmother. And then after that, I show a photo of his grandmother as a baby with her mom. And I just thought they looked so alike. So like, here's like Drew as a little kid with his great grandmother,
Salt Lake City,
and there's his great grandmother. Like, to me, it's like they both had such a similar, like, kind of face. I don't know, maybe it's just that kind of baby face sort of thing, but there was just something about it that I thought, I don't know.
In Salt Lake City to Stanley Pitts Russell and Iva Hattie Weston Scout.
This is crazy. I was actually just asking how do you say that? My grandma's brother. So is that uncle? About what he remembered about his grandma and his great grandma. Maybe some of this will ring a bell.
Stanley was a first-generation American with both of his.
And this is his family. This is video of his family. I'd found some film that one of his cousins had put up online kind of discreetly somewhere, but I was able to figure out where it was. And I got a lot of it. And I wasn't 100% sure of who was who. This was one of the roadblocks I ran into. I kept trying to contact relatives and be like, can you just tell me which one's Vera, which one's Stanley, who's Hattie, and I couldn't find anyone. So I had to go by context clues of various things. And I thought I figured it out, but I wasn't 100% sure. Cause like here on screen, that was either Drew's great grandmother, Iva Hattie, or it was her sister, June. And then this, I think, was Stanley, but I couldn't remember.
Parents having been born in England.
That was for sure.
Oh, wow.
Hurry, pillow window replacement is on sale now.
And then like that photo that it just went off of, I'm pretty sure that was Hattie with her husband.
Wow, that's crazy. So my great-great-grandpa was first generation. That doesn't go as far back as I thought. I thought we had been here for a minute.
Vera's yeah, that line of his family, the Russell side, yeah, that was really recent English. And well, yeah,
Father
Russell and
Stanley
Pitts.
was a first-generation American, with both of his parents having been
So
born
that's
in
Stanley,
England.
I think.
Wow.
Vera's
on the
mother, Iva Hattie, who also went by Hattie or Harriet, was born in Utah in 1907.
I think I remember hearing about this lady's name, actually.
John Weston Scow and Susanna Cheshire.
I'm like trying to map this out in my head. If I have heard from the older generations this name, I think I did.
The fourth of 11 children.
So he actually had a double cousin relationship in his family where Iva Hattie, his second great grandmother, married a Russell, and then June, born in 1919, also married a Russell. So Drew's family are double cousins to June's family because they're cousins through June and Hattie, and then cousins through the Russell.
Dang! Wow, and there's a lot of, they had a ton of daughters, like 3 boys.
Stanley and Harriet were legally married in Utah in 1928, which I realized their marriage was almost 1 year after Vera had been born. I couldn't find anything which indicated the deeper story, but I would later learn that it wasn't uncommon for couples from their church to have marriages that
The
were
LDS
recognized by the
I
church.
tried to keep it
before
low
having
down
their
at this point.
legally civil marriage.
Oh.
Granted, that seemed to be more of a 19th century thing, and I don't know if that was actually the case here. Stanley and Harriet would go on.
I loved, this was my favorite picture that I found, because this is his grandmother, his grandmother's brother, the one he was saying that the guy he was talking to before, and then their younger sister. And I mean, look at how much his great uncle looks like. I mean, that's the similarity between Drew and his great uncle, at least in this photo. But it was just such a cool photo because this is them hanging out 1940s Compton on the car.
Such an awesome
two
picture.
More children, a son and another.
That is a crazy picture. I love the old car in the background.
Another daughter.
I would have loved to see the reactions of his like mom and his grandmother's siblings, because his grandmother has unfortunately passed away not too long ago, a few years ago, I think, if I remember correctly. But yeah, his like some of her siblings are alive, and then obviously, you know, he's got a lot of other family members and stuff too. And so I was actually saying to him, and I say to all of my guests, I'm like, if you have family members who would want to react to this, I would love to have that, because, you know, especially with the family members that are older, they're the ones that I would think would, you know, more of this stuff would be like, oh my gosh, I remember this and this and this, which is one of the reasons why, if you've never interviewed family members about your family, highly recommend doing it and just going through what you found, because sometimes you'll be surprised the stories that they'll be reminded of that they just, no one ever asked me. I never thought to tell.
Stanley worked as a roof shingler in Salt Lake City, but in the late 1930s, the family moved to Compton in Los Angeles.
And so that's his grandparents, if I remember correctly, over here on the left.
Dang, I'm from Compton. I knew it. Wow, that's crazy. Actually, I just now remember my grandma used to say all the time that she loved Compton. So that is not a joke. That is so funny.
To work various jobs throughout the years. In the 1940s, Stanley was working as a truck driver for Ream Manufacturing.
I actually looked up that Via Wanda address in Long Beach, and it's the same building that when his family lived there.
At their Southgate factory. Then in a 1942 city directory, he was listed as a shipyard worker. And by 1950, he was back to roofing again. Stanley would pass away in 1972.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously never met him. My great-grandpa, I mean, I wasn't even close.
Hattie would pass away in 1994.
Oh, wow. I mean, I could have met her. I don't think I did. I was 2.
Years after Drew was born.
He probably did meet her and just doesn't remember, or at the very least, you know, they were at gatherings together, I'm sure, because I mean, the whole family lived in
both of Harry's parents were born in Utah, which made sense because Drew had told me that he believed this line of the family had been part of the Mormon Church. So my next step was to confirm if that was true. Lucky for our research, the Mormon Church, or what
They
they prefer to
documented
be
it?
called the
Nickelodeon was kid everything, but that marked one of the darkest chapters.
A lot of ads on this.
Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which sometimes just goes
We're 7.5 minutes in. We've already had
by
like
the
3
LDS
ads.
Church, are heavily involved in genealogy.
Oh, wow.
Now,
That's
this is
cool.
connected to the LDS Church's belief in proxy baptisms, which are basically baptizing already deceased people.
I imagine for a lot of people when they saw my video, this was like they learned a lot about the Mormon Church. And I actually had a lot of people from the LDS Church commenting on my video and on Drew's reaction, basically saying, thank you so much for doing this. And, you did it in a way that really shows the history without being degrading, blah, blah, blah. And, so that was kind of cool to see because, I definitely understand there are certain issues with the church, but at the same time, I just discussed the history.
So genealogy allows you to build your family tree and baptize your ancestors.
Wow.
The LDS Church is also the largest holder of genealogical records in the world,
Oh,
even
dang.
housing the largest.
I was just in Salt Lake City, but I didn't have any time while I was there to really visit the library. It wasn't that far from where I was at,
archive of
though.
records in a mountain vault known as the Granite Mountain Records Vault. There are census
That's
records
crazy.
for church members.
Keep it in like a
and
big old
membership
vault like that.
records, so we can easily see if they were part of the church. Vera's family shows up in these various church records, and I even found Vera in the 1935 church census records. This connection to the church likely meant that the family already had an extensive family tree built out.
Wow.
And even more
So-
likely, it was being hosted on the church's genealogy website, Families.
Their side of the family was like super more. There's a lot. Oh, well, like he was saying, they might have been baptizing post, what's that called? After death?
Which is a free website which hosts billions of digital records as well as a collaborative family tree. A collaborative
Thanks.
family
Here's
tree
good.
means
Again,
that everyone
go
works
subscribe.
from the same family tree. So if two
It's a good
people
video.
end up putting the same person in their family trees, that is then merged together.
Mm.
This is actually the same type of thing that Genie.com and WikiTree do as well.
That makes sense.
But being that Family Search is the LDS Church's website, it has become the central hub of the 3 collaborative trees with the most information on LDS Church families. I quickly found the family in the Family Search tree, and the amount of information connected to the tree.
Yeah, I know some of these people. I don't know who has it all, but I remember my great grandma Vera. She like hoarded a lot of stuff, and if I can only find that stuff, she probably has old pictures somewhere. Actually, my parents might have that stuff. I should have looked for that.
Extremely expansive with
Yeah, I know that my great grandma's husband died like really young. She never remarried. He just like had a heart attack on the couch.
And unique records attached. The first thing to catch my eye was that Harriet's paternal grandparents were born in Denmark.
Wow. So we have my great grandfather's side born in England, and then my great grandma's side, great grandma's side. Yeah, great. Add one more great in there. Born in Denmark. That's
Yeah, well, actually, to be more specific on that part, the Weston Scout side was from Denmark. If I remember correctly, the Cheshire side was also from England. It was just like a generation or two back when they actually came over. So it's really only the Weston Scout line that I found that he had Danish ancestry. And everything else was just all his other Mormon ancestry.
That's really interesting because every time I would talk about my Nordic ancestry, whenever that would come back with that data, I always, as you probably should, you go back to like the Viking days, when the Viking invasion of the British Isles was happening, because a lot of people from the British Isles have lineage to the Nordics because of the Vikings. But to see that there was a direct line, not even that far away, it's like, wow.
To their story,
it's not like I'm just 1%
Harriet's grandfather
from the Nordic countries, I guess.
Hans Olsen Weston Scout.
Can I do the percentages now? I mean, this is only one line of my tree, but since we now have data on this, 20.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing with the DNA percentages that people should do is have kind of a basic family tree. Obviously, not everyone knows how to build a family tree. It does take some skill, I guess, to do that. But, having just a bare bones of, back to your grandparents or great grandparents or, as far back as possible, really on as many lines as possible. But the more that's how you can kind of make more sense of the admixture results. So kind of like what he's doing here with like trying to remember what were the percentages he had. but yeah, you can kind of do that because I think it was Hans Olsen Weston, or his most recent fully Danish ancestor, who was let's go back a little bit. John Weston Scow, that's his third great grandparent. So when we're kind of thinking of how much do you inherit from each person or ancestor, 25% from a grandparent, 12.5% from a great, 6.25 from a second great, which would be Harriet, and then John Weston Scow, that'd be about 3.175, I think that is, or I don't know, so 3 point some odd percentage. Actually, here, I always forget I have this. There we go. So 3.125. So you can, that's what you'd expect. So that if you were figuring out, well, how much would I get, assuming there was no, recombination was perfect, no randomness to it, it would be 3.125% of his ancestry.
Can I do the percentages now? I mean, this is only one line of my tree, but since we now have data on this, 25, 16, I think like 7% of me is Danish. Is that the right? I don't know if I mathed that right.
Drew's fourth great grandfather was a well-documented figure in the LDS church history and had led quite an interesting life.
1835. This also gives interesting perspective on like the Civil War times. If they're in Utah, I don't really know what they was doing. They was just chilling over here doing nothing in the Utah territory.
One of the things I loved about Drew's reaction was it was a lot of commentary of like, well, I guess I wonder what this would be like. And then it's something I cover later in the video. And that made me really happy because it just made me think like, okay, I am hitting all the questions that people have, which is what I really wanted to do with the narrative style of like, as you're going through, you're like, okay, well, what about that? And then all of a sudden it's like, here's the answer. Oh, sweet. So it's like a lot of the stuff he's like, I wonder what, how did they get there? And what did they do? And it's like, I covered all of that later in the video.
I guess.
So Olsen Weston Scow was born on the 17th of September, 1835 in a town on Falster
This is actually so funny because I just watched the Book of Mormon in London. Oh, man.
Denmark as just Hans Ulesen, Hans the son of Ulla. The name
I spent a lot of time looking up how to properly pronounce Ulla.
name Weston Scow came from the word Weston Skov, which was something Hans's father Ulle had been nicknamed as it roughly.
Man, this is so cool. I feel so happy to be getting this information.
Woods, because Ulle is said to have lived in the western wards of the town. Hans came from a very musical family, with his father Ulle being a professional musician who taught many on Falster Island, including Hans and his siblings. Hans started learning violin at the age of 7. By age 9, he was playing dances alongside his father. And by the age of 12, he was playing parties all by himself.
That is cool. I was playing in a band before I really started YouTube. I liked music a lot. I guess this is
Hans's brother Peter
connection here.
The same with the.
There are so many YouTubers who are in bands or who have been in bands, and I think there's been a running joke amongst a lot of us that we need to have a YouTuber band of just because I used to be in bands. Mr. Beat was in bands. I know that there's like a whole bunch of other people that are at least musical. A lot of other YouTubers are musical, at least in the history educational sort of space.
Brothers traveling to neighboring towns to play parties and dances. When Hans was born, his family was part of the Lutheran Church. While Hans hadn't been very religious, he did have a few religious experiences in his youth. On one occasion, Hans was walking home from playing a dance in a neighboring town when something all of a sudden overpowered him.
Oh, wow.
It was about a mile away from where I lived. On my way home, it comes to me that I was overpowered of some unseen power which I cannot here describe.
Nice
I did pray earnestly to the Lord for the first time for his help, and my prayer was answered, and it all...
Go on the adventure you've always dreamed of with a fast and...
Must say, a bit luck that they had an unusual last name, considering how much Hansen and Peterson there is in Denmark. Well, technically, he was Ulla Hansen, but they just ended up taking the name Weston Scow because they kind of already.
Man, this sucks. I've never been to Denmark. I was close to going to Denmark, but then I didn't see a reason why at the time.
kept my prayer
They
from
were
that
nicknamed.
time
I guess I need to go
till
now.
this day.
There was another story of Hans coming home after a dance and
Hans
hanging his
Olsen.
violin on the wall before going to sleep.
because from what I found, and I guess this is common with a lot of Scandinavian countries, is it's a very, it's a typical patronymic system for the name. So it's, Ulla Hansen, Hans Ullesen, and, Peter Ullesen, and, Ulla Peterson, and, depends on what your
His mother
father
and sister
is.
were standing next to his bed when they claimed the violin slowly floated up and away from the wall, and then back to the wall, going back and forth 3 times.
This part, I didn't know how to actually, I wasn't sure of the best way to represent it. So I just made the corniest little animation. And
Home after a dance and hanging his violin on the wall before
I was
going to
laughing
sleep.
when I made this.
His
I was
mother and
just like,
sister
well,
were standing next to his bed when they claimed the violin slowly floated up and away from the wall, and then back to the wall, going back and forth 3 times. They told Hans about this when he woke up, and his mother said that she believed it was a sign from God that he would do something in the music field. In Hans's autobiography, he talks about the first
Dang,
time
he has an
hearing
autobiography
priests in 1851, and he
This
says,
is clearly a big member of the
I
Mormon
always
Church, I
believed
guess.
Mormonism from that time until I embraced it.
it wasn't until years later in 1862 that Hans and his brother were baptized into the Mormon Church.
Wow.
At that point, Hans had
In
been
Denmark, I'm wondering, like, or did he go to? When does he go to Utah?
married for a few
Oh no, I don't think maybe he doesn't.
years and had a 1-year-old son named Ulla. Just a year later, in 1863, Hans left for Utah with his wife,
there you
who
go.
was pregnant, and son.
Wow, what a
Hans's
time to go to the U.S. I guess we're gonna get into this.
brother Peter had been called to serve in the Danish army to fight Germany over the Schleswig-Holstein
I was
region.
going to.
Yeah, I actually had started to try to research further into the brothers' involvement, Peter's involvement in the Schleswig-Holstein War. If I remember correctly, I think it was this, because there were 3 of them. I can't remember which one it was that he fought in. Obviously, it's whichever one took place in 1863, or I think it was, or one, or I don't know, 1860s. But I ended up having to like cut that because I was like, yeah, I think I'm already adding a little too much.
I was
this
literally
story.
just thinking about this. Like, oh wow, that brings a whole new context to that war.
For only 10 weeks, but fighting in 8 battles.
Wow.
Shortly after Peter finished his service in the army in
Oh, he didn't die.
1864, he left for America.
1864, a year later.
Their sister Magdalena, who also went by Lena, would join them just a few months later. Something especially important to Lena is she had promised their mother on her deathbed that she would stay with her brothers. Well, this was all turning out to be quite an interesting story. Now, that actually, I talk about the 3 siblings, but there were other half siblings of theirs. There was a half sibling through their father, and I think there was also a half sibling through their mother too. I can't remember for sure, but it was kind of a interesting family dynamic. But it was the 3 full siblings that all came to the U.S. I wanted to understand the overall history connected to this, so I had a lot of questions to answer. What were Mormon priests doing in Denmark in the 1850s?
That is so interesting.
How long had they been there?
They were
By
clearly
learning the larger history of the area, that might be helpful in understanding Hans's story.
They must have been sending out missions. I mean, they do missions still, but to see that they were doing missions in the 1800s, crazy that the LDS Church only was founded in 1830. So all this happened like 2 to 3 decades. They were already going to Denmark recruiting people.
To Professor Lynn Henriksen from Brigham Young University to help me understand the
BYU,
history
that's right.
a bit better.
Hello, my name is Lynn Henriksen. I'm a retired professor of linguistics and English
I've
language
always
at
liked BYU's football team. I will say that.
Brigham Young University.
I love college
As you
football.
might guess from my last name, Henriksen, I am Scandinavian, Danish. So I've had an interest in my Danish ancestry for many years. And that led me to do research on Danish immigrants to Utah. As a language learning teaching professor, I've studied many languages in my career. People always say, you're a linguist, so how many languages do you speak? And linguists don't like that question because most of them speak just 1 or 2.
That's funny.
And
I did this interview with Lynn Henriksen probably like 6 or 8 months before the final video came out, maybe even longer. And because like I said, this was probably one of the longest ones in terms of how long it took me to finally get it out. I have some other YouTubers where I'm, it's taking a lot of research, but like I haven't really even hit the point of kind of writing the episodes. With Drew's, I'd started kind of to get the episode written, and then things really hit
They look
the
at other
wall.
aspects of language, but I have studied different languages, about 9. The
Oh,
last
wow.
one of all has been Danish, my ancestral language.
Wow.
And so that began, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 years ago. And
I'm remembering all the memes about Danish language, something about like it sounds like there's a potato in your throat. That's so funny because now that comes back to me. Apparently,
studying that language allowed me to create this specialty on Danish immigrants
what's really
in the United States. So that's
wow.
where the connection becomes between linguistics.
What's really cool about what Jarrett did here is like it's cool that he went down. This is my pure maternal line. So my mom's mom's mom. She
Yeah, it was close when he was describing this. It was like, not quite. It's the maternal line until you get to the Weston Scouts. It's like well, I guess, yeah, because it's his maternal, it's up to his purely maternal second great grandmother, but then it starts looking at her father's line. So he's kind of right, but
it just
kinda
went
not here.
straight down. That's exactly, we're following that all the way down.
Immigration with these Danish immigrants that came to Utah.
My first question for Professor Henriksen was, what was the general religious life like in Denmark, and how accepted were these Mormon missionaries?
Well,
I think Denmark was
traditionally,
Protestant.
For centuries, Denmark and the other Scandinavian were Lutheran. It wasn't
Yeah.
until 1850 that the Danish Constitution was amended to allow for
No,
freedom of
his
religion.
mitochondrial
And
line
that
is
led to
not
an opening
Danish. It
for
was
representatives
English.
of other religions to come in and proselytize. And among them were the missionaries. We say Mormon, the official name of the church is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The church leaders were actively sending out missionaries to the world. The church was organized.
This photograph, I try to be as on point as possible with what I showed. And this photograph was like one of the first known missionaries for the Mormon church. I forgot what his name was, but like this was like early on sort of thing. So a lot of stuff that like I tried to basically, if someone was in the LDS church, they'd be like, oh my gosh, she actually used the right thing, or, you know, stuff like that. So maybe that's why I got a lot of comments of people giving me some props.
In
from the LDS
1830,
church.
Yeah.
and sent missionaries out immediately to the eastern United States from New York.
That is crazy. I mean, that is so fast to be immediately like, boom, let's get everyone in this.
By the 1840s, they'd gone to England and converted thousands there who'd come to, many of whom had come to the United States. By this time, the Latter-day Saints had been moved from New York to Ohio to Illinois to Missouri.
They got pushed further and further
finally
out east
bumped
or
clear
west.
across
West.
the plains to Utah
Wow.
in 1847.
Settled on
But
Salt
in
Lake City.
1850,
This is random, but one of I remember just my grandma's, just my mom's mom. She always wanted to return and live out the rest of her life in Salt Lake City. That's something that she always would say. She loved Salt Lake City.
despite their difficult circumstances in a new land, and they started sending missionaries out again. Erastus Snow was one, and Peter O. Hansen, a Latter-day Saint who had joined the church in the United States. He was an American, but he had Danish ancestry. I think he might have been born in Denmark. They were the first missionaries to go to Denmark.
Wow.
That was in 1850, and they had great success, and pretty soon other missionaries were sent.
Professor Henriksen also
Yeah,
discussed how the translation
it's crazy how
of the Book of
successful they
Mormon
were in
to
recruiting.
Danish made a huge impact on conversions in Denmark.
You asked about the Book of Mormon, and that was a new experience when the first missionaries went
I
to
think we're talking about the
New
stage play.
England and the United States and up into Canada. They preached in English. They spoke English. But when they got to Scandinavia, English wouldn't do.
And that's so interesting. I mean, obviously at this time, the 1800s, Scandinavia was not teaching as a second language English. Nowadays, I mean, what, 90% of the population speaks English?
So this was really the first experience in the church history where the missionaries had to learn new languages.
Wow.
Someone, had to
Danish should be a
convert
difficult one.
The Book of Mormon.
I think one of the things I cut out of the video was I mentioned that, Lynn actually mentioned that I think the next closest or the next translation after Danish for the Book of Mormon was Hawaiian or something like that. So like it was like really close, but apparently they had missionaries in Denmark and Hawaii in the 1850s translating the Book of
Mormon
Mormon
over into Danish, and Peter O. Hansen was the guy who did that.
Wow.
And that was part of his work. You know, get up every morning and translate a portion of the English Book of Mormon into Danish.
Wow. That
I also
does
asked
not
why
sound
they
fun.
likely joined the
That sounds
church
very, very difficult. I mean, I guess it wouldn't be that difficult if you were taught a couple different languages at a young age, but
and eventually decided to migrate to America.
And I read the history of Hans Westenskau, and he had some spiritual experiences. rather unusual, the violin floating
Floating.
off the wall.
Yeah.
But a lot of people did have spiritual experiences. Others are attracted by the doctrine that was preached. They then, in many cases, left their homeland and came to the United States and eventually to Utah, to Salt Lake City. That would be the arrival point. The first.
That is a long journey. You think about that in the 1800s from Denmark, you're probably going over to New York. And then from New York, you need to take a carriage or horses all the way out to Salt Lake City. Seems like kind of a dangerous journey, to be honest.
This is one of those foreshadowing points where it's like, ooh, I'm going to actually talk about that.
It was at this time.
To the Latter-day Saint gospel. The first 4 principles of the gospel, we say, are faith, repentance, baptism.
At Amica Insurance, we know this isn't.
There really are a lot of ads on this one.
Baptism and the laying on of hands for the gift of the Holy Ghost, which is not too unusual in Christian churches. But they also added a 5th one, which was gather to Zion. So there was a real need for people who felt pressure and the need because of the Latter-day Saint idea that this is the latter day. These are the latter days. Christ is coming soon, and we need to gather to be in a safe place. 46,000 that converted.
Utah Scandinavian population. Wow. Most were from Denmark and then Sweden, Norway. Norway started getting their numbers up a little bit, but not that much.
At least 26,000 migrated to Utah. And in those days, Utah didn't have
wow.
that.
So this guy, I think we're talking about my great-great-grandpa or great-great-great.
Yeah, and they would have been in the 1860s one. So you can see that in the 1860s, very few from Sweden or Norway, mostly from Denmark. The ones from Sweden and Norway don't really start to pick up until the 1870s.
I don't know 3, but he must have been one of the first, one of these 1800s.
So this was quite an increase in the population.
There was 2 in 1850.
Composed 9% of the population, which is a pretty large minority.
This really explains why economic demographics-wise, Utah is an extremely, it's very European, I guess. This is how to phrase that.
We call push-pull factors. So some factors pulled them towards the United States and Utah, like the promise of economic success and the gospel, the gathering to Zion idea. There were other things like persecution. Once they joined a non-Lutheran church, many of these people found they were persecuted or at least ostracized. My great-grandfather joined the church and worked managing a brickyard.
Man, look at that guy's mustache.
Said,
that's crazy.
If you want to be the manager of this brickyard, you have to have your children baptized in the Lutheran church. And so he eventually said, well, I'm going. I'll leave. And so the combination of factors.
So one of the things that I found out after I put out the video was this part of Lynn Henriksen's family that he was talking about was not the one that I put the photograph of. Apparently, like I forgot what it was, but there was like a real close similarity between them where it's like I thought it was a bricklayer, but he was actually like something else with bricks or something. So like had brick in the title. So yeah, afterwards he was like, yeah, that's kind of something that, you know, if you could change it. I was like, unfortunately, the video is already done. I can't change it.
Led a lot of people to come to Utah.
Hans's trip to Utah was only briefly mentioned in his own writings, but his sister Lena documented her own trip quite well in 1864.
Ooh. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That is
the Mormon missionaries helped fund Lena's trip with something called the perpetual emigration.
Man, they must have had some money because this would cost a lot, I feel. Bring all these people back to Utah.
The group Lena traveled with had about 350 people altogether, all of whom were described as converts.
Putting them in the bottom of the ship, maybe?
They first sailed to England, taking a 3-day trip, which had heavy rain almost the entire time.
The North Sea is not a good place to go. That's what I keep seeing TikToks about that. The North Sea is terrifying.
Making many of them sick. They landed on the east coast of England and took a train to Liverpool before continuing their journey to America.
Man, I don't even like to do 12-hour plane rides. Can you imagine this? This is definitely taking like 6 weeks.
America had 9.
I really tried to play it out at this part to really get the emphasis of like it was a long way and like each part had its own section.
974 passengers, and Lena described the ship's crew as rough and ill-tempered.
I mean,
Lena had befriended
I think I'd be too if I was on a ship all the time like that.
They were all conned on the trip by an elderly man who pretended to be a missionary and said they could entrust him to keep their valuables safe. Instead, after they gave him their valuables, he disappeared and was never seen again.
Oh, yeah. Not surprised. There's probably a lot of people did that stuff.
After a grueling 2-month journey, Lena's group landed at Castle Garden in New York. They then traveled by steamboat to Albany before taking a train west.
Wow.
The converts weren't well treated on this trip, and because this was during the Civil War, the group found themselves in cattle cars so the active soldiers could take the nicer cars. Once they arrived at the Missouri River,
assuming they stayed out of the South at this time, probably
another steamboat
or anywhere
up
near
to Wyoming.
the fighting.
In Wyoming,
That was an interesting comment when he made that, because I was like, you know, I don't know if I found anything kind of saying about them avoiding certain areas, but it certainly makes sense that, you know, make sure you don't go through active battle zones. Granted, an active battle zone during the Civil War, a little bit different than an active battle zone today, but still kind of an interesting thought. But for the most part, I mean, there were multiple kind of trails in a sense, but they all kind of seem to go about the same.
Wyoming, they then joined a company of immigrants led by missionary William B. Preston, and then had to travel the last 1,000 miles on foot.
Oh my goodness.
Every once in a while, Lena would pull out her violin to play for everybody. Along the way, Lena fell in love with a man named Marcus Funk, and they'd be engaged before the trip's end.
Wow.
They finally made it
That's
to their
one way
destination
to bond with someone. Going through a journey like that, walking 1,000 miles.
on September 15th, 1864, having started their trip on April 22nd, 1864. Taking just under 5 months to travel about 5,200 miles.
5 months. Okay, yeah, that's a lot longer than 6 weeks. That wouldn't be fun.
It was expected that the road to Zion would be a difficult one,
Yep.
that God's
Anyone
people
recognize
should
this
go
voice?
through much tribulation
Oh,
to
that would
become
be
purified
tough.
as gold. With
She was
this
in the stream
understanding,
earlier,
all
yeah,
were
you-
determined to
you're gonna
bear
come
with
out of that-
Well, not
meekness that
experience.
which
She's in the
seemed to
chat
be
on
their
stream.
lot, going forward to their ultimate reward, a home in Zion.
Wow.
For anyone who didn't get it, that was Mrs. Beat, Shannon Beat.
Just to be so determined to get there
This
for
was a
5
pretty
months.
common
That's
experience for these Danish immigrants, but they did have somewhat of an idea before leaving of what to expect.
and again, and these were some of the first ones. I bet you got a little bit easier through the other decades. 1870, 1880 probably got bit by bit easier, but they were some of the first.
To help them prepare for the travel and for assimilation, they
Most probiotics don't survive digestion. That means whatever you're taking for your gut.
had English classes in Denmark before they came.
Oh, that's
They
a smart
also
idea. Start
published
teaching them English on the
guidebooks
trip.
in Danish for them to help them know as they were traveling across the ocean and across the plains and so forth, what to expect, what to come prepared with. Most of them went on ships, maybe to Liverpool, which was a major disembarkation point from the continent or from Europe. The early ones, I guess, went on sailing ships, but more often in the later years, after the 1850s, they came on steamships, and they would arrive either in New York City or Boston, perhaps. And in many cases, they would go all the way down and then come up the Mississippi River to St. Louis. The early arrivals had to walk or go by horseback or in wagons, and the covered wagons we see in cowboy movies, up until 1869. One interesting thing about
the
the
Oregon
Danish
Trail.
immigration in the years before the railroad was
literally
that
that.
they were known for using
Pretty much.
hand carts, which were small wagons with no horse, no ox, just a man or a woman or both.
Wow.
Maybe their children pushing and pulling. There's
These
a famous
people had to be buff.
children's Mormon hymn also. For some must push and some must pull as we go marching up the hill. And verily on our way we go until we reach the valley. Oh,
Yeah, singing would.
I don't know why. But
Singing
when I
probably
did
makes
that
the journey a little bit more
transition
bearable.
between
Hans
You
had
gotta do
arrived almost
something.
the
exactly
singing chorus, the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. That I don't know why I thought that was a great
1 year
transition.
prior
I
to his
fully
sister
acted on
Lena.
it. Now you all
Hans
know.
mentions in his autobiography that he paid for the passage of 13 others, 11 in Falster and 2 more in Liverpool.
Was that
Hans's
$150?
group arrived
I wonder what that translates to. $1850, $150. I mean, that's thousands.
in Newark on June 13th, but weren't allowed ashore until June 15th. They quickly boarded a train to
That's
Albany
probably
and arrived 1
10,000.
day later. The same day that they arrived in Albany, Hans's second son Peter was born. They then took a train to Florence, Nebraska, but not long after arriving in Florence, on July 2nd, Hans's first son Ule died at just over a year and a half.
Oh yeah, that little kid from the picture.
Just 4 days after the death of their son, Hans and his family left Florence, Nebraska with the John Franklin Sanders Company. Hans
I would find that so difficult to like have your, 2-year-old baby die. And then it's like, all right, a few days later, now we've got to leave where we buried our 2-year-old son. And, I kind of wonder if they ever went or even knew where they buried him and like went and visited the grave or something.
This group finally arrived at their destination
From
on
Nebraska.
September 5th, 1863. Well, it took these
3-month
newcomers a little
journey.
while to get set up. They were expected to become productive very quickly. Professor
Dang,
Henriksen
you just got
told
done with this 5-month journey. It's like, all right, guys, it's time to get to work.
me about an interesting
Start building them
Brigham Young
houses.
speech given to a group of new arrivals, which highlights this sentiment.
Brothers and sisters of the Lord Jesus Christ, you have been chosen from the world by God and sent through his grace
Man, this guy's
into this valley
beard
of the
is
mountains
crazy.
to help in building up his kingdom.
I love
You are
Drew's
faint and
comments
weary
about
from your
the
march.
facial hair.
Rest
It's
then
so funny.
for a day, for a second day should you need it. Then rise up and
You get
see
2
how you will
days.
live. Be of good cheer. Look about this valley. Your first duty is to learn how to grow a cabbage. And along with this cabbage,
mean,
an onion, a tomato, a
I guess it's
sweet
kind of
potato.
important to be learning
Then
how to grow
feed
food.
a pig, to build a house. The next duty for those who, being Danes, French, and Swiss, but who cannot speak it now, is to learn the English language, the language of God, the language of the Book of Mormon, the language of the latter days. So they went to different places around the state. Often they went to a particular place because that's where they had friends or relatives. This thing we call chain migration, where
Yeah.
you go where someone that you know from the old country usually
Yeah, and you start
lives, and
hopping.
they'll put you up and help you get settled for a while.
The family made their way to the town of Manti in Sanpete County.
Yeah, look at this. I
Utah,
mean, because Utah was still a territory, right, at this time. So it was all broken up into weird pieces.
a town which is about 100
Or maybe
miles south of Salt Lake
This might be
City.
just county borders.
These
I love how he slowly realizes, like, wait, I'm just looking at a county border
newcomers
map.
faced a few challenges in their new homes and assimilating into the overall culture.
It was just a county border map.
Especially learning English.
Yeah, I mean, I can't even
Professor
imagine coming from Denmark going to rural Utah in the 1860s.
Henriksen explained further.
People who study this say they faced three major enemies. Okay? One was
Disease.
the climate.
Okay.
They came from Northern Europe. It was
Cold.
a lot more moist there. It was cooler. Now they were in the Great American Desert. Another enemy was the Native Americans, although they didn't have so much trouble getting along with them as they thought they would. In fact, some of the Scandinavians learned more Indian language than they learned English.
That's
especially the
hilarious. I
children.
mean, they weren't
But the
that far
third
away from the Comanche, right? I mean, that would be pretty terrifying.
enemy
The Ute, which is why I believe it's called Utah.
was the English language.
Ute.
And they really struggled with English, even though Danish and English
Obviously, I get into
are,
it with the Indian War stuff coming up.
related languages with common Germanic ancestor.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like learning, going from like Chinese or Japanese to English. I mean, there's very little connection there.
This was very important for them to be able to integrate into the communities, become part of the kingdom of God in Utah. Brigham Young declared English was the language of God. I was mentioned here.
The guy from
Sociolinguists
BYU.
have noted that different religious groups
The guy-
have
the-
often
the naming.
regarded the particular language as central to their faith. And so for these Latter-day Saints, English was very important. It was the language of the Book of Mormon. It was the language of the gathering.
I didn't
And
realize
so
how
it
important English was to
for the
Mormons.
Scandinavians
That
to
makes
learn
sense.
English. And they wanted to, but that doesn't mean it was easy for them. Okay.
Hans, Peter, and Lena would continue their work as musicians, and in 1866, Hans
like how
and
these two have
Peter
the same
joined the
beards. Is that
militia
just the
as
style?
musicians to fight in Black Hawk's War.
Oh yeah,
The war
I've heard about
started
this.
in 1865, but the conflicts between the Mormon pioneers and the Native Americans dated back to the 1840s.
This guy got shades on?
Relations between the pioneers and natives had been
crazy.
very peaceful at first. The Mormons wanted to be friendly and helpful to the natives because they saw it was in their own best interest. With Brigham Young once saying, "It
This
is
had to have been the
cheaper
style to
feed
shave your
them than
mustache,
fight
right?
them." Even more so, the Mormons viewed Native Americans in a special light because the Mormons believed Native Americans were a lost tribe of Israel. Native Americans viewed the Mormons as outcasts and were initially friendly with these pioneers. Relations slowly soured over the years, and multiple massacres happened throughout the 1840s and 1850s, with Mormon pioneers even taking some Native Americans as slaves,
Ooh.
including women and children. By the time Hans and his siblings had arrived,
I mean, this was
in
still
Utah,
before the slavery.
hundreds of Native Americans had already been
1865.
killed and in
I have to say it was very difficult to research this war, this Black Hawks War, because there's technically multiple of them. But part of it was that it seemed to be there was contradictory stuff between sources, and especially like sources would claim stuff, and then I'd try to look into the citations, and either I'd find stuff where just like there weren't very good citations, or the citations led to something that didn't seem to add up to what that person was saying. And I remember one of the things that was a part of that was the whole, taking women and children as slaves. And so I was like trying to find specific accounts of stuff. And I kept running into different things of when people were taken as slaves and who was taken as a slave. And so I was like, I'm not going to get into that because that would require really, really in-depth research. And by the time I had gotten to this point of writing the script, it was like, I was already like a year behind. So it was like, okay, I can't get too hardcore into it.
Enslaved, as well as 8 Mormon settlers having been killed, 4 of whom had been Danish immigrants still on their journey from Denmark on a similar path that Hans took. Things really began to get worse in the summer of 1863, right before Hans and his family would arrive. The family's first few years in Utah would include multiple fights between the settlers and Native Americans, eventually leading to Black Hawk's War. I basically found no reference to Hans and Peter's experiences in the war, with their biographies and obituaries mentioning this only as a small blurb. But their pension records
that's probably
show
a good
both
thing.
of them served for 1 year and 8 months as musicians.
Really? Were they the drummer boys? Oh man, I was just making jokes about those memes. When you're playing your flute and your homie gets shot in the chest, you're like crying, but you still have to keep playing.
Peter continued their focus on music by running choirs, orchestras, and other musical organizations throughout the area. They were constantly discussed in the newspaper and played multiple large events.
This is a war.
Hans even followed in his
happening
father's
within the
footsteps
Civil
by
War
teaching music to many students in
at the
the
same
area,
time.
and has said that he taught all the early day musicians in the Manti area. Hans and his wife Karen would have many children together, but at this time it was commonplace for men in the church to take multiple wives. Hans was urged by his wife to take a second wife.
Now, what's interesting about this story of his wife urging him to take a second wife is that this was written about by children from the first marriage and their in their biographies of the family. And one of the children who I talk about in a bit in the video, he writes like pretty specifically about the event, like with like the conversation they had about it, or at least what he heard,
which he did in
Wow,
April
by his own wife.
1869, marrying Karen Elizabeth Hansen, and it would be through this marriage that Drew descends from Hans.
Oh dang, to the
I also
second
thought
wife.
it was interesting that both of his wives were named Karen, and I imagine that
oldest
Dang, to the
I also
second
thought it
wife.
was interesting to be through this marriage that Drew.
So that's John Weston Scow. That's his third great grandfather. Drew's most recent fully Danish ancestor.
Drew descends from Hans.
Oh dang, to the
I also
second
thought
wife.
it was interesting that both of his wives were named Karen, and I imagine that must have been somewhat confusing throughout the house.
I think that makes it a lot easier. Karen wins dinner. They'll both give you answers.
Hans and his second wife would have multiple children together, including Drew's ancestor John Weston Scow. In looking for possible records for Hans's second marriage, I noticed that the registered date was actually October 10th, 1887. This seemed quite odd, and I wanted to see if I could figure out why they would have a civil marriage 18 years after the original.
Some interesting research at this
point.
point.
I couldn't find
All the
anything
doggies.
indicating the exact reason. It seemed to be connected to the Edmunds-Tucker Act of 1887.
So they were not allowed to.
The Edmunds-Tucker Act was a law which attacked polygamy by going after the LDS Church and the Perpetual Emigration Fund. This law was actually an extension of a previous law from
Definitely something I noticed in my research.
known as the Edmunds
Difference between
Anti-Polygamy
LDS
Act,
sources and non-LDS sources.
which basically banned polygamy and took away rights from polygamists, including voting, holding public office, and even serving on juries. The 1887 laws were enacted due to the lack of control the previous law had over polygamy, so this new law disincorporated the church and the Perpetual Emigration Fund. The Perpetual Emigration Fund was the same fund which helped finance Lena Westenskow's trip from Denmark to
Ah, so they weren't sent.
This law also took away the rights of women to vote. That's right. In Utah, from 1870
Oh, that's right.
up
I did
until
hear about this.
1887, women had the right to vote. A
Yeah.
law which had been passed by the Utah
Weren't they the first?
territorial legislator. The Edmunds-Tucker Act included all women, not just those in polygamous marriages. I even found a public statement from famous women's suffrage fighter Susan B. Anthony opposing the bill and calling it obnoxious.
Dang.
One stipulation with this act was the requirement for civil
that.
marriage licenses. This is how I learned that it wasn't uncommon for Mormon couples to have a marriage recognized by the church, known as a celestial marriage, before they had a marriage recognized legally.
Oh, yeah.
Which I didn't want to say in the video, but I later, well, I guess technically it was a little bit later that I really found it out, but I learned from a lot of people in the LDS church that it was like, really was not uncommon for people to just have celestial marriages and not even record it civilly. The Tucker Act became law on March 3rd, 1887, and Hans officially married his second wife. When I found this newspaper, I thought about putting Nelson, like an image of Nelson from The Simpsons up, just like pointing the that's it right there. But as you know, President Cleveland has placed his signature to the Edmunds-Tucker bill. The news received with the acclamations of joy on every hand.
There's so many newspaper clips here. That's amazing.
Later, in
Found
October
all these.
of 1887. While I don't have confirmation that this is the reason, it seemed like
a little bit of full
Hans's
history
first
too.
wife died in 1884, just 3 weeks shy of her 45th birthday. Hans's second wife took care of all the children, 9 children from the first marriage and 3 children from the second marriage.
Dang, these kids they all have the same exact face. That's crazy. That doesn't even look real.
William Westenskow, the youngest son from the first marriage, wrote about his stepmother saying, "I can truthfully say that she was always a good mother to us."
Wow.
He's the one, William Henry Westenskow, who I'm pretty sure who his biography talks about his mom telling his dad, "Yeah, you need a second wife." Dude.
Hans would begin working in the
which I kind of wonder, like, did she have some sort of other motivation of like, oh my gosh, this guy's so annoying, get some other woman in
Temple in 1888, helping people with their genealogy. Hans's son William wrote that Hans was instrumental in obtaining genealogical records from the old country for many people in the area. In Hans's autobiography, he even boasts about having added over 2,000 names to the temple registry. And I think this adds a really interesting layer to the entire story.
Twist.
And that a lot of the research and work Hans did in the temple likely helped preserve a lot of the family history researched for this video.
Yeah,
Hans would
that's
work
crazy.
at the temple until his death in 1919 at the age of 83.
Notice his wife, Anne, or the listing of his parents, Ulla Hansen Westenskow and Annie Hans.
He lived for so long.
To have died from natural causes.
1919, man. This is the time period where people weren't necessarily living that long.
Hans's
right after World
siblings,
War I.
Peter and Lena, would also lead very fulfilling lives with many descendants and a strong legacy. Peter died in 1911 at the age of 73 due to a heart disease, having a total of 19 children with 2 wives, 11 through his first marriage and 8 through his second marriage.
Dang!
With all but 2 making it to adulthood. Lena would die in 1928 at the age of
Overall, that's
80,
pretty good numbers. Only 2 didn't make
had
it.
11 children.
So
with 8
Californian.
making it to adulthood.
Wow.
Drew had also done a DNA test, so I wanted to check out this line that we had built for the Westenskow family against his DNA matches.
Ooh.
Just using through lines, Drew had 18 genetic matches who also descended from Drew's 3rd great-grandfather, John Westenskow. 42 matches through his 4th great-grandfather, Hans Westenskow, and 60 matches through his 5th great-grandfather, Ulle,
the 3 siblings.
Most recent ancestor of Drew's on this line to have been born and died in Denmark.
Dang.
Helping confirm
In
everything
Denmark.
we had built for this part of Drew's family.
So I got a cousin in Denmark. I got to go find those foods.
probably
If you enjoyed
multiple,
this video,
many
be
That
sure
was
to
awesome.
check
I didn't know any of that.
Just
I guess I
all
was only
this thing.
hinted at my, family's history from Utah. I actually still have a part of my family that lives in Utah. I know that. I'm gonna try really hard to not be like one of those Americans that just like, yo, I'm Danish now.
Huge
Literally
part of your
100%
family.
Danish. Again, please go subscribe to this channel. That was an awesome video. Big thanks to my patrons. You can find a link in the description.
So yeah, so that's that. Those were the reactions. So this one, like I said, the Drew video was so difficult. So much work went into it. A lot of things that I had on my list of research questions that went unanswered. So it was tough, but I think one of the things that I did really like about the research on Drew's family was it was a really good example of, even when you have a well-documented family, piecing together the entire story was really difficult, because it was a lot of, like, Hans had his own autobiography, multiple of the children had biographies of the family, other people around them had, biographies, a lot of other Danish migrants and stuff. Basically, a lot of them realized they wanted to be remembered, they needed to keep a diary or journal or something. So a lot of them did that. So even though with all of that, dude, no, we'll go out in a bit. My dog's scratching at the door. But even with all of that, it still took a lot of work to piece it all together.